How are you, man? I'm Gil Roth, and you're listening to a bonus episode of my Virtual Memory Show podcast. This is a COVID check-in episode where I record with a past guest of the Virtual Memory Show to find out how they're holding up during the pandemic. As far as how I'm doing, I'm okay, both up and down, conflicted, we'll put it that way. I sent the first issue of my zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, out to the printer yesterday, and now I'm putting together my mailing list and figuring out the best options for shipping and considering what sort of bare bones website I can put up for it, and otherwise just kind of reveling in getting over the anxiety of hitting the send button while thinking about all the stuff I would like to write for future issues. On the other side, I am really questioning whether I should continue with this series of check-in podcasts. They were good as a chronicle of pandemic life and how creative people are dealing with the COVID-19 era. This whole situation, as I capitalize it. But the protests, police violence, threat of martial law, all that's made it really difficult to figure out what the appropriate tone is for conversation, both for me and my guests. What is okay to talk about? The last few I recorded, the ones that are coming out next week, really reflect that tension. I mean, is it cool to talk about personal issues and weird little quips and light conversation and all that? Or is it time for really serious debate about the future of America and race relations and the militarization of police? I don't know. And if it is the latter, am I equipped to have those conversations? And is that something you want to hear from me and the people I talk to? Or is it better served by, well, A, by people who are qualified in terms of their credentials, et cetera, and B, frankly, by more non-white people? Because I'm white. Most of my guests are white. Makes for bad optics, I guess. So that's what I got to think about over the weekend. If you got any thoughts about this, if you'd like the show to stay sort of the way it is, just so you can get these personal check-ins and maybe forget a little about that part of what we're all going through right now, let me know. Otherwise, well, just I'd love to hear from you guys. So let us get to today's guest, which was a different sort of tension in its own way. Author and photographer Kipp Friedman is joining me this time around from Milwaukee. Kipp and his brothers, Drew and Josh Allen Friedman, kind of adopted me as an unofficial cousin after I recorded with each of them in 2013 and 2014. Kipp's the youngest of the three brothers. There's also a half-sister who's a bit younger than them. And he's the author of a wonderful memoir, Barracudas in the Attic, about his childhood. The childhood is notable because they are the sons of the great writer Bruce J. Friedman. And at the very beginning of this episode, Kipp broke the news to me that BJF had died earlier that day. He wanted to go ahead and record. Later in the episode, we just focus on his dad and the writing and the approach to writing and the example that Bruce J. made. It was sort of a tough conversation, a little like what I was talking about earlier, because I didn't know exactly what tone to take, because this is news to me. This is his father. I was afraid Kipp might sort of break down in the middle of conversation. I was afraid I might break down in the middle of conversation. But to his credit, and I think because of his father's years-long decline in health and the fact that he was 90 and they sort of knew this was coming, but still, it's got to be a shock. Anyway, Kipp kept it together, really honored Bruce J.'s memory as a writer and as a father. At least that's what I think. You can decide for yourself. As caveats go, this one's filled with them. The central air conditioning in my house turned on partway through. My dog got up, shook himself out, walked upstairs at one point. You might hear that in the background. Kipp had some background noise going on also, but this is the best I can do, man. Here's me and Kipp Friedman.
I should tell you, Gil, before we start, that I'm doing this interview with a slight heavy heart because my father passed this morning.
Oh no, that
Yeah,
was.
so yeah,
I'm
but
so
it's
sorry.
not a surprise. I've been saying goodbye to
No,
him for 12 years and honored every moment I saw him. So he just turned 90
yeah.
a month ago.
Oh,
Still,
yeah.
it's a bit of a hit, but I felt that I should plow on. I know he would, and uh,
I know.
and I'm willing to share that if you want to talk about
Oh,
that as part
definitely.
of
Well,
this.
if it's okay to keep this part in, to me, your father was one of the great writers of the 20th century and one of the people I am so honored that I got to sit down and record with because, um, yeah, he meant a lot. I know, especially talking to Drew over the years, I know your father's health had been in decline, so I know what you mean. But I know this has still got to be, with the circumstance, with everything else going on, this has got to be tough. So my normal opening question is, how are you dealing? But I guess that's, going to be shadowed by all this stuff. But let's try that anyway. How are you dealing?
Uh, it's been a very interesting time. A lot has changed. Not all for the bad, I suppose, personally, although for the country and for friends and other folks, a lot of people are hurting. But in our case, our son, who's 30, who had lived in Chicago, moved in with us 2 months ago with his girlfriend. So we've been getting along really well. He's a great chef. I probably told you that years ago when you talked to me the last time.
Yeah.
Not only does he eat good food, he likes to prepare it, and he's quite good at it. So we've been the happy beneficiary of that, and we're getting along.
That could be a mixed blessing, though. That could be a mixed blessing depending on how much exercise you're able to get in this whole situation.
Well, that's another nice thing about this situation. I've been a tennis coach for about 7 years, and while all my coaching for schools went down the drain in March, I've been getting private lessons. So now I have more private lessons than I've ever had before, and it's just going out and helping people hit the ball, basically, and I enjoy it.
And you mentioned that in an email to me that of all recreations, that's the social distancing one that works, right?
Yeah, I apparently the CDC and the Attorney General or whoever, people have been talking about, well, there's tennis as the perfect social distancing sport, although they tell you to mark the tennis balls. I'm not quite sure why, but I don't go to that extreme. But, we make sure that if anybody's tennis ball drifts over to our court, I give them an angry look and I hit it back with my racket rather than touching it. And I ask them
Yeah.
to do the same. But there's a lot of love in tennis, and it's a great way to get out and clear your head, I guess.
Mhm. And your primary gig, at least when last we spoke, was a photographer primarily for bar mitzvahs. Does that? I know that must have dried up, but was that still your main field?
Yeah,
Until now?
I mean, I've been a mixed bag for the last 7 years since I kind of went semi-retired. I've been coaching tennis during the seasons, and I've been teaching chess to kids. That's another offshoot that kind of came about, which I enjoy doing. Tennis is like chess, except on your feet, and chess is like tennis, except it's at a table. There's there are a lot of similarities in strategy and tactics. So they lend themselves to each other. And then I do photography from time to time. My bar mitzvahs kind of fell into a hole and were postponed. So I haven't been doing much photography except for fun. I go out and do nature photography, and I have a couple of friends. We go out and kind of do social distancing photo shoots of interesting landmarks or buildings in Milwaukee area. So I keep myself fresh that way, I guess.
Yeah. What's the vibe been like as far as pandemic world? I'm in northern New Jersey, where
Yeah.
basically we just went into full shutdown mode pretty quick, and I know Wisconsin had its election issues, but what's been the tenor in the
Well,
city?
like a lot of places, it depends on who you ask. Milwaukee is a little bit, or Wisconsin is a bit schizophrenic. You've probably read about it in the news where this apparently the swing state that'll decide the fate of the universe in the next election, assuming there is an election. But my sense is that people are being responsible, and by and large, they're taking necessary precautions. No one's freaking out. Actually, more people are upset about the killing in Minneapolis of that man by the police, and the protests, and what's been going there. I mean, it kind of reflects the nation's ability to shift gears to another fear, another thing to worry about on top of, the economy and COVID. Now we're worried about social unrest and military takeovers. I mean, again, it depends on who you ask, but I think we're pretty level-headed as a state, and people are feeling more positive about things. I know personally friends are going back to work or partially back to work. I'm getting more work assignments, and people are sort of opening up. There's a feeling that, this, maybe we've kind of turned a corner, and, starting to feel more positive, while still being responsible and respectful of other people. That's my take.
Sure. Yeah. New Jersey's starting to get better, and I'm just so shell shocked. I'm convinced I'm going to be like the Japanese soldier who hid in the jungle for 30 years and didn't know World War II had ended. That I'm just gonna, I'll wait a little longer before I get my hair cut or interact with another human being. But
when you come out of that cave, you may not recognize anybody.
That's my thing. I figure I'm gonna win the hair game at the end of all this, but I don't know how I'm gonna pull it off. Yeah, I've kept the beard relatively trim, but otherwise, things can get out of control. But,
well, at our age, I don't know if we'll have too much hair, but
that's my thing. I'm closing in on 50, and I'm gonna grow this out as long as I can. I figure that's my last hurrah. But
absolutely.
Now, when you first had to make the transition into social distancing, pandemic life, etc., did you find it difficult in those terms, or did the sort of freelance life you have kind of make it, I don't want to say an easier transition, but one that you could at least relate to?
Yeah, I actually think you're the latter. I had already transitioned like 8-10 years ago. So a lot of people are going through now what I was wringing my neck about, worrying about a decade ago. And since then, I've kind of shifted into this kind of semi-work, semi-retirement phase where I'm kind of doing things at my pace. And because of that, I think I'm more comfortable about it. It doesn't mean I don't feel bad for others. And also, my wife retired a little over a year ago, so she's loving it too. We've just been very conservative and tried to watch what we're spending, and we cook more. And we have a great big Labrador Retriever named Loki who is loving everything. Including,
I seem to remember that dog was puppy sized when we first recorded. God, 2013, I guess.
Yeah, well, now he looks like a medium-sized black bear, and he's very helpful. He's been a wonderful source of love and affection, and just a distraction too. He's just happy to be there, and my son living with us has rediscovered him not as an irritable, annoying puppy, but as this great big pal that he can hang out with. So he's just soaking everything up, and he's my dog, but I share him with other people.
Understood. Yeah, ours, well, he's got separation anxiety whenever my wife leaves the house, literally steps outside of the house. We do wonder if he's getting a little too weirded out by our constant presence, and both of us are working from home already, but the fact that I never go, I don't go to business, I don't leave for any extended stretches, we think he's starting to get a little well, who knows, one of the two of us is going to be more damaged by the end of this. I'm inclined to think it's me, but we'll see if we need a dog psychologist too.
Depends on what kind of dog you have, I guess.
Greyhound. So the laziest dog in the world, except for the 2 minutes or so a day that he goes crazy active. But
sure.
Yeah, But tell me, you mentioned also when we were corresponding before this, getting back to a novel that you were
Yeah.
working on a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell me without jinxing yourself, given that you've published nonfiction before, and I don't know if you understand the jinx of talking about working on a fictional project while you're in the middle of it.
Well, up until you said that, I wasn't aware, so now I'm a little nervous. Uh, no, after writing the nonfiction piece about my family, uh, I thought about what happened next, because I kind of left off when I went to college. And
Hmm.
when I graduated, I became a newspaper reporter in South Florida in the 1980s. And I worked in Palm Beach County, different parts of Palm Beach County, Boynton Beach, Boca Raton, Delray Beach, and West Palm Beach. And I met the most interesting cast of characters at both newspapers. I made friends and learned about real cultural differences. I worked at a secular weekly newspaper, my first job out of college, and one of my colleagues who worked in the ad department was a good old boy. I guess you'd call him a redneck. And we kind of palled around. He's older than me. He was a kind of a vet. And we'd drink beer. He'd probably drank a little too much beer and had an interesting way of looking at the world that I wasn't familiar with. And then after our paper literally went out of business, I got hired by a Jewish newspaper that covered the whole county. So I went from covering city hall and small town politics and characters in Boynton Beach to all of Palm Beach County's Jewish community. And it was just it was a shift in what I was focusing on. And incidents happened within the Jewish community that I didn't expect. And all of a sudden, one day, I got a call from the head of the Ku Klux Klan, this old man who was kind of a sad character I never heard of. And he just called out of the blue and started chatting me up. Afterward, I found out he's kind of a sorry old guy that was just seeking attention. But slowly, things started happening in the community where the Klan was reestablishing its presence, I guess. And there was another incident involving an unsolved incident involving some old Jewish veterans at a veterans park. They got assaulted at night, and they never caught the perpetrators. And I reported on it, and then all of a sudden, this Klan guy started calling out of the blue, and it led to down the road some rallies and more of their presence, and they kind of disappeared after that. But that mystery of that accident, that assault, just stuck with me. And the Klan leader calling me out of the blue and telling me racist, corny jokes that just like made you scratch your head and say, "What?" And then other odd things involved that guy. I mean, just things that just didn't make sense. It just made me think about that period of my life. And I met a lot of rabbis, and I met a lot of, well, let's face it, in Palm Beach County, it attracts a lot of people escaping from the Northeast. It's a place where people retire and also apparently escape to. You get a lot of con men and interesting characters. There's a whole genre of South Florida fiction. Some of my favorite writers.
I was going to say, you get the Carl Hyacin type thing.
Yeah, I was reading Carl Hyacin. I was reading Elmore Leonard. There's another gentleman in Orlando area that has a whole series of kind of comic novel characters involving a character named Serge Storm and his sidekick, who's this stoned out hippie who they just wreak havoc upon South Florida. And so these are some of my favorite writers. And I had this story to tell, and it just haunted me. And then 3 years ago, I started writing about it because I had to. And for about 2 years, I was on a roll, and I finished it. Wasn't really satisfied. It was a first draft. And putting all my energy day in, day out, I was semi-retired, and I almost burnt myself out. I was subsuming myself, and I had to take a break. And that was about a year ago. And I was so excited. I mean, you go through these highs and lows as you're writing and piecing together this narrative, this story, this arc, these characters, the dialogue, the background. And then all of a sudden I'm thinking, I'm just cannibalizing myself. I got to get away from this. So I took a year off, and then the COVID happened in March. And I thought, maybe this is a time to kind of look at it again and try and get enthused about it again, because I kind of left it off with a bad feeling. And sure enough, once I got into it, it was like, I really like this story. I could see things, glaring changes that needed to be made. Maybe there's too much dialogue, there's too much background, too much sidetracking, of information that slows the story down. And I've been at work at it for like 2.5 months since then, and it's coming along really nicely, without jinxing it, of course.
Of course, yeah. That's it's one of those things. I actually just went through the same thing, except on a much smaller scale. The zine that I had been promising to make for about 4 years through the podcast. The idea that people who gave to the Patreon, I'd actually, make this secret project. It was going to be a zine, collection of my writing, excerpts in the show, etc. I finally finished it. In fact, 10 minutes before we started this conversation, I finished the first one at 32 pages. I locked it down. It's going off to the printer in the morning. And it was one of those, same thing though. There was a degree of, I've got some time now, yes, I'm still working on a lot of other projects. My day job is insane, but I had this sense of, I haven't looked at these pieces of writing in quite a while. Let me look at them now and see. And, that whole sense of fresh eyes where you could see, what needed fixing, what was nice to put in, but didn't need to be there. All that stuff is a really kind of interesting process.
Well, I've heard from other people that have recommended that. In fact, a guy I played tennis with, he wasn't the most pleasant fellow, but we did play tennis. And he said, well, you really should take 6 months off. That's what writers do. And he mentioned this famous South African writer, because this guy was from South Africa. I forget the writer's name.
Katsia is the only one I know, but
that's the guy.
Yeah.
He says you're supposed to take 6 months off from any novel you're writing to just get away from it. But I wanted to take 6 months off from playing tennis with this guy. And he was right. And in fact, my brother Josh and I spoke the other night, and we were sharing information, because he's also been doing some writing. And he said, yeah, you should take time off to give yourself fresh eyes and reinvigorate yourself and find encouragement, little things. Josh was helpful when I was struggling on the Barracuda memoir years ago. And he said, just keep going, keep writing, don't stop. And that's all I needed, at that time.
And that's something where, again, like when you have family for whom this was an occupation, where they know not just the inspiration side of it, but the technical and work side that goes into it, that must have been helpful, but also intimidating, depending on, how neurotic you are. And knowing you're a Friedman, there is neurosis out there.
There is, but it's sort of guided neurosis or structured neurosis, if there's such a thing. I never felt that intimidation factor, really, never. But a lot of what my dad taught me, or didn't really teach, but would say about the writing process, about his own frustrations, sunk in. I can hear his little comments about things. I mean, I can't cite anything at the moment, but I hear his voice telling me things. His favorite way of reading, his favorite storytelling techniques, when something is considered believable, or if it's far-fetched, and what to do. I mean, little techniques, I think being in his presence, or listening, probably gave us an advantage.
Was he in mental shape to help you at all with that first draft a couple of years ago, or was it already a little too difficult to send him?
It was too difficult, although he knew the subject of what I was writing about, and he actually remembered back from the 1980s when I was telling him these stories. And probably in the back of his mind, he was encouraging me to maybe write about it in some way, and I forgot. Yeah. But he knew,
or
he had a tremendous memory. He would cite things that I had forgotten, that perhaps I didn't think he was paying attention to. And so I kind of had a steel trap mind for key things that were important. And I think back often about things he said, and my brother does too. Both my brothers.
Yeah, do you see him as a literary influence in your style of writing with this one? Or do you have, you mentioned some of those Florida novelists, which is not a different tone than your dad's fiction.
An influence in that one should take risk. One should try. One should give it a shot. That to write takes courage. And perhaps Josh and I were talking about this the other night. When you take risks, you may at some point self-censor yourself or feel the need to, say, well, why would someone want to read that? Or maybe they would think badly of me, or they wouldn't understand I shouldn't write that. And we both agreed that's not what Dad would say. He would say, do it, take it. It's your voice. It's not their book. It's not their story. And besides, if it's fiction, you're wearing a mask. That's what my dad used to say. No one knows, you can write anything you want. The courage of your convictions, I guess, is the way they put it, but that's not something he would say. But, he just wanted you to express yourself in an honest, true way. And ultimately, if the story is good, if it's well written and people can believe it and it's fun, that's what matters more than, whether it's quality lit or, it doesn't have to be, Faulkner, not that there's anything wrong with Faulkner,
But no, I get you. It was, I can't remember if I even told you. No, I don't think we were in touch at that point. But when I just sat down with hundreds of pages of your dad's fiction leading up to our podcast in early 2014, I had that moment where I realized all the years that I thought I was supposed to be this Thomas Pynchon / Philip Roth, et cetera, sort of writer. I'm like, oh no, I was supposed to be a 10th generation knockoff of Bruce J. Friedman all these years. My bad. I was actually, that's just the freedom that was there and the not needing to be cosmically tied into the paranoid universe a la Pynchon. That was my moment. I thought, oh, okay. I gave myself freedom. And that's been the biggest lesson I got from him also just through reading that stuff was that sense of permission.
Yeah, freedom is a good word for the Friedmans.
Yeah. Now, the rest of the family doing okay? Josh wrote a couple of days ago to tell me, fine, but I don't want to record anything. There's nothing to talk about. So,
Well, everybody seems to be pretty good spirits. I'm talking to you today with a slight heavy heart because my dad passed, but we're all doing well. And, we do stay in touch in our own way and, only good things to report, I suppose.
Now, who you been reading or were you able to read once this whole thing hit? Did you find yourself, again, having to kind of refocus in some of the reading or even watching, et cetera, that you'd been doing before?
Yeah. Actually, I have a friend that loves 20th century espionage war novels. Eric Ambler, you know him? He's a British writer that wrote in the 1930s and 40s about creeping fascism in Europe. And one of his best books was The Mask of Demetrios, which was made into a movie. And then there's another writer named, I think his last name is Falk, Falk, who wrote a series of World War II pre and post novels. And then there's a Philip Kerr, Kerr, who wrote about
it's pronounced Carr. I was just about to tell you. Yeah, it's pronounced Carr, but it's spelled Kerr. Yeah, the Bernie Gunther novels. I have all 15 of them or 14 of them.
I read the first 3 or 4. So my friend turned me onto those first. And then I graduated to Eric Ambler and this other person whose name escapes me. I think it's Falk. So I've been reading those, which are a great diversion. The sad part is that so much of what they wrote about is prescient. It's contemporary because they're dealing with the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s in different regimes in Italy and Romania and, and other countries. And it's so eerily similar to some of the tone of what we're experiencing these days. So I was trying to get away from current events, and I found myself sucked right into it through these historical espionage novels. That's what I've been reading. I'm also reading a wonderful book called The Underland. I think the writer's name is William McFarland. And it's
Robert McFarland.
Robert McFarland.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard it's wonderful.
It is. It's wonderful. It's a meditation on man's interest and existence in going underground for various reasons. For not just for funerary reasons, to bury people, but to put remnants from your past, to get away, to literally to hide from invading armies. It's what happened in if you in the Middle East. But he just does this wonderful way of tapping into different cultures over time, and there's a lot of history involved and religion, and it's just learning a lot, and ultimately it's just fun. It's scary as hell when he describes caving and going into these narrow little tunnels that narrow out into you can barely move your head, and if one rock shifts, you're stuck there. And my wife won't go near it. She won't read any of this. I'll say, you should want me to read you a paragraph? She said, no, I don't. I'm claustrophobic. I don't want to even hear about it. But it's good stuff. So I'd highly recommend that. If you want to talk about escapism, go Underland.
Yeah. That's I've heard great stuff, and that meditative quality you brought up. He did the introduction to one of my favorite nonfiction books, The Peregrine, which I will send you a copy of at some point if you haven't read it yet. But it's just a very bitter misanthropic man watching peregrine falcons on the eastern coast of England in the 60s, but beautifully written. But anyway, that is me and my weird discoveries and obsessions. But and have you been doing everybody else is binging on Netflix? Are you participating or diving into Tiger King or things along those lines?
I've kind of tapped into everything from Netflix to Amazon. My son got me onto the Criterion Collection, so
that's a great service to have.
Absolutely, I've finally been able to crack into Bergman films that I put off. I loved what's the chess one called? Where
the Seventh Seal?
The Seventh Seal is probably one of the most perfect films I've ever seen. Storytelling and the look of it, the visual, the black and white imagery. Yeah. It's iconic. It's just overwhelming. And Andrei Tarkovsky, a Russian filmmaker.
Yeah, I watched Solaris on the service a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get by all the kind of pedantic, if you can get by all the pedantic kind of sci-fi philosophy dialogue, which sometimes gets a little long-winded, he's just a brilliant visualist. I mean, just the look of everything is wonderful.
Yeah, I got to do Stalker sometime when I have
Stalker
3 or 4
is the one
hours.
I'm thinking of. That's the one I watched, and visually it's stunning. And what's fun about that is when you see these old films, you can see how they influenced other filmmakers, films that you're more familiar with. I was watching an old French film from the late 60s about a farmer who took in a Jewish boy from Paris. This old farmer who's he didn't know he was Jewish, by the way, and he takes him in and protects him during the war until it's over. And there's a scene where the old man is trying to cheer up this little boy, and he stuffs things in his mouth, and he holds his hands up, and he kind of like growls out like, ugh! And I'm thinking, my God, that's Marlon Brando in the death scene in The Godfather, which came 2 years later. He's doing Brando. Then I realized, wait a second, this is 2 years before Brando was
you go
doing
to
this
IMDb
guy.
and you realize.
Yeah, I realized Brando was ripping off this guy in this one scene, and it's obvious, So those are one of the fun little things I discovered.
that was the joy of discovering The Third Man finally, which I'd always heard about and only finally watched about 8 or 9 years ago, and suddenly had this is where almost every action thriller of the last 50 years has taken stuff from. Now I get it, including Miller's Crossing, my favorite Coen brothers and all-time favorite movie. Miller's Crossing has a bunch of Third Man homages, we'll say, instead of ripoffs. But
now is that the one with Orson Welles in the sewers?
Yep.
Harvey Lime, is that his name? Harry Lime.
Yeah,
Harry
and
Lime.
he's got the monologue up in the
the Ferris wheel,
up in where they're looking down, and much like today, trying to figure out how much money each of those little lives would be worth, and how many you would let die in exchange for 20,000 pounds.
Oh, when he's looking at the people and he described me as like ants or something. I remember that.
Yes, they're all little dots. Oh yeah, just watch that monologue and think about we should be reopening because the stock market is important. But beyond that, like, you mentioned being able to get out and, social distancing with your photography pals and being able to shoot. Have you had that degree of freedom throughout this, that sort of flexibility to get out and about was there a stretch of we're locked in basically until further notice?
I have a 95-pound dog bear that needs to be walked 4 to 5 times a day. So, and I'm his walker. He walks me, basically. He takes me for a walk. So I'm out and about. But I also am married to a former healthcare worker, a nurse. She's on top of COVID. I call her the Nostradamus of doom because she reads these studies almost hourly they're all in red, and they just show where COVID is and what the numbers are from day to day and hour to hour. So she studies this Talmudically, and she's not Jewish, but she's on top of it, and I just do what she tells me to do. And that's also a good way to have a happy marriage.
All things considered, I think that's our big lesson. But I guess just as the last question goes, have you, not in a self-improvement-y kind of way, but have you learned anything in the last couple of months sort of about the way you live, about the things that either matter or don't as much? Has there been a sort of, I used to think X, Y, or Z mattered, but when you get down to it, I really don't need those in my life particularly. Or are the things you're just dying to get back to and holy shit, I can't wait until, boom, I'm allowed to do this or that?
I just think that this whole period has reinforced decisions I made leading up to it. I would have lived pretty much the same way, whether there was the COVID or not. But what I've seen is that other people have caught up to me. I used to say, I've got all this free time and I'd love to go out and eat lunch and maybe go have a beer, meet friends. But everybody's so busy and they're my age. And where are they? And my wife would say, just wait. You'll see. They'll catch up to you. You just started a little earlier than they did. But, more and more people will come around and kind of have your sort of lifestyle. Well, I didn't know it would be this much of my lifestyle. I didn't anticipate that, and I'm glad people are starting to go back. But I've been sort of prepared without anticipating this. Like I said earlier, we're kind of conservative to begin with. So we assumed that there would be a market downturn. We assumed that there'd be something that would affect, the economy and people's lives. We didn't assume a triple threat, protests and military takeovers and death and dying. But I actually am being hyperbolic. I think things will smooth out. It's just it's been a rough patch. Let's just put it that way. But I just feel like I've been preparing for this stage in my life, and it's supposed to happen the way it is. And I hope everybody else is reaching those same goals, I guess.
Yeah. You were there and everybody else is being dragged into it. So,
by the way, Gil, I don't know if you wanted to chat about my dad or not. And, the fact that,
I'm just trying to figure out how to even talk about it.
Yeah.
but tell me about your father.
No, I mean, it's just too, I'm sorry. I just
I know
didn't know if you wanted to go there or not.
No, I do. I just,
You can give it more thought.
I don't want to put you in a bad emotional position.
Absolutely.
No,
I just
I'm with it.
sprung
No,
on you.
trust me, I've been trying to figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's the, I mean, I assume you can't come out to New York. We're not having funerals still at this point. So,
yeah. We're still processing it. We don't know what's going to happen. I'm assuming there'll be a story about it in tomorrow's paper, the New York Times, but we don't know. And we're just in a hold pattern. And there's been talk when things open up more, to have some kind of tribute event in the city where people can gather, because we're not going to do it by Zoom. That's for sure.
Thank you. That's what my follow up to that is, if you don't keep me in the loop about that, I will hunt down and kill all three of you, the three brothers, basically, because, I would love to pay my respects, any way I can.
Well, there will be opportunity.
Like I said,
it's just, we're just going through this, and it will happen. It just might take a little bit of time.
Yeah. No, everything is early. The city is still essentially locked down for any real gatherings, unless, that's the irony, unless you guys were all Orthodox Haredi Jews, in which case you could just flout authority and hold big extensive funerals and stuff in Brooklyn. But the one time it comes back to bite you. That's the
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen.
No.
But
by the way, what was your favorite work of? Oh, go on.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was going to ask, what's your favorite either story or book of your old man?
That's a tough one. I recently reread Stern, his first novel. I haven't read Mother's Kisses. I think it depends on what time of my life. When I read Mother's Kisses, I had just gone off to college in Madison, Wisconsin. And my father told me, that's the kind of book you should read when you go off to college, because it's about a guy who goes off to the college in the Midwest. And so I could relate to it, although my mother didn't follow me to Madison, drive me insane. But I loved it. While reading it, I made the mistake of sharing it with a girl I was dating briefly, who pretty much attacked me over a scene in the book where she said, "Do you think of girls as trading cards that you just want to collect?" And I was like, "Well, I didn't write that. My father wrote that, He's like, "That's not me. That's my father, and it's fiction. So you can't blame me for that. You're not a trading card."
But deep down, no, I'm just kidding.
Well, she also ate raw onions with her burgers, so that was kind of a deal breaker too.
Oof. Yeah. See, for me, every Yom Kippur, my tradition is to read "When you're excused, you're excused." The one your father does about the guy who decides to get out of going to shul. But,
that's my favorite short story of his, and I had told him that quite often, and he would tell me, that was Paul Desmond's favorite story too. Paul Desmond, the alto tenor, the saxophone player that worked with Dave Brubeck. They described his playing as like a dry martini. He was a friend of my father's, and he loved that story too. And I love that story, but there's so many. That one I always enjoyed the most, I guess.
Yeah, that was the lesson that came both from the short fiction and from reading his memoir in the correct edition, because your brother Drew corrected me when I said I was reading the hard. No, you can't read the hardcover. You have to get this e-version. That's the right one, and set me straight. But just your old man's lesson that you just have to ask the if. What if this happened instead of that? And that the moment that leads to what becomes the movie of Dr. Detroit, but the anecdote about the pimp in the Indian restaurant, and what if this happened afterwards, and how you can just let things extrapolate and let a world open up.
You're a true BJF fan, because that's a great way to describe his work in a nutshell. Okay, you see something happen to you, and you ask yourself, what are the ramifications of what if this happened instead? Let's see where it goes. And then he'd be off. And there's so many examples that I actually witnessed literally. And he was able to use it as a flight of fancy to create other works. That's how his mind worked. These things didn't just happen in a vacuum. Often he experienced things and then allowed his imagination to fly. That's a rare talent, that you can take something and go with it. I don't know if everybody even wants to do that, much less has to do it. He was compelled. He couldn't stop himself from asking those questions, often in restaurants or movies, or boorish behavior, and it would lead to some stinging comment, and often even a story or a book or a novel or a movie. I mean, it's funny how inspiration works, and that's something we paid attention to. We observed firsthand. That was part of the fun of hanging out with him, was storytelling and watching his the way he perceived things.
Was there ever any sense of Dad's just using us to come up with a story? Like a feeling of being thrown into certain situations with, he's just trying to manipulate us into something that...
No, actually, on the contrary, there are probably times where I thought, why don't you write more about me? I'd like to see myself in a story. Maybe I got a story. You can include me. And in fact, a lot of people would come up to him and say, "You wrote about me in that book. That's all about me." And there'd be like 10 different people that would say that. That's a book about me. And he would laugh about that. And he said, "It's funny how people read into what he wrote." I suppose there are things that my brothers and I did that wound their way into some of his works. It's invariable. I mean, some of his more autobiographical stuff. That's my answer.
No, I'm with you. I just wasn't sure at all, like whether there'd be that sense of being mined for material, or whether you'd resent not being mined for material, which sounds more the case. So,
well, in our case, being a true Friedman, we were like, why don't you write more about us?
Well, there was also the great moment, and I think it's somewhat telling, but you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong. When I was sitting with your old man, I asked, there's a shelf of your books behind you, and off to the side here is also a shelf of books by your sons. What's more important to you, to see? And he pointed to his, because he said, without mine, they wouldn't have theirs. So, that's sort of why this is more important. So.
Well, that kind of reminds me of, he was once asked, is he happy to have 3 sons? And in typical BJF manner, he said, all in all, I'm glad I had them, which I thought was kind of funny. Me too, by the way. I'm kind of glad he had us as well.
I still fall back as it was an accident, not a happy accident, but I'm an accident, and I managed to stick around all this time. So
he's kind of fun in that he could just rattle off something immediately on observing what other people are saying or doing. Give you a case in point. Like 2 years ago, we were visiting him. He was 88, and we were posing for a photograph, and Josh just said, "Why do they always say smile? I wonder who invented that." And my dad basically just said, probably the dental industry. And then we all laughed. That's his sense of humor,
Oh, man, I've just seen his obit showed up on the New York Times. The only positive thing about doing these remote ones is that I can quickly refer to things online where, when you and I sit down in an incredibly cramped hotel manager's office in Soho, that, we have a radiator sticking into the side of my leg, it isn't as easy to look up information and stuff. But,
but it wasn't as noisy as... It wasn't as noisy as Sammy's Romanian. Isn't that where you interviewed Drew?
No, Drew was the Second Avenue Deli. And then Josh, after you, I'm on the ferry, about to get on the ferry from New Jersey. And he's like, the hotel's kind of boring. Go meet me at Cafe Edison in the Deuce. Like, okay. Sure. it's three Friedmans in a row. You all are going to put me in weird, physical, locations to record a show. I'm used to, I'll roll with the punches. And so, yeah, Josh and I also recorded with just dishes clattering and people everywhere. But
well, probably whips and chains and bondage noises coming from other rooms.
Right. That's, life in the old, semi-old Times Square.
Exactly.
But anywhere you are pining to go, if once we're allowed to go places, is it getting back to New York? Is it somewhere else?
Well, yeah, we were supposed to be in New York last Friday for 4 days. We had booked a Airbnb in Corona, Queens, to go explore Chinatown. We had it. We booked it in January. My son and his girlfriend and my wife and I were going to go there for 4 days at the end of May and eat all the Chinese food in Flushing. And obviously we canceled that in March. Probably wasn't a wise place to go. But Anne and I, my wife Anne and I, are planning on going to the Balkans in October. We have a reservation to go on a trip of 5 Balkan countries, starting in Hungary and making our way down Croatia, Montenegro, Bosnia, Herzegovina, the Dalmatian coast. Is that in Croatia, I guess? It's sort of like a circular route. And I'm a photographer, so I love traveling to different countries and just casually taking street shots and scenes that interest me. Not typically touristy photos, but odd things that catch my eye. We were in India a few years ago. We were in Morocco last year. 2 years ago, my wife and I went to Japan. We went to Turkey about 5-6 years ago. So we were going to go to the Balkans, and it's still on the schedule if they allow it. And that's our next big adventure.
Well, keep our fingers crossed. That's I'm supposed to have a trade show in Milan in end of October, early November. No one thinks that's going to happen because trade show means everybody's crammed into, convention center, bad circulation, people shaking hands, etc. So,
well, one thing I was looking forward to as a photographer, I finagled some gigs at the Democratic National Convention in Milwaukee in July.
I forgot. Yeah, I was going to be there.
I was going to be there too. I had some paid gigs to be there and just take pictures. And I was going to meet all the senators and probably Biden, but that's not happening. So that was a bit of a disappointment.
And last words, or something you did. And this is going to sound terrible and put you on the spot again, but good terms with your father? I never got the impression that you guys were on any sort of conflict, but
my dad was in my thoughts every day for most of my life. I've never had a bad word with my father in my entire life, neither him with me either. I described him as being permissive, understanding, and just a lot of fun. I carry his words with me, his spirit with me. Hopefully I can share that with other people. I think my brothers feel the same way. We're truly, it was an honor, if they can say that, to have him as a father. Nobody's perfect, but he just was a lot of fun, and we were able to go along for the ride with him for a lot of it. And it's like a magic carpet ride, really, the things that we saw and experienced, and just being in his presence, listening to him and the way his mind works in all different scenarios. And he was pretty much the same person. Years ago, he taught me something, though. He told me something when I was in my 20s, when I was going off to college, or before that. He said, no matter where you go, how old you are, how much distance there is between us, I'll always still be there with you. Just remember that. He doesn't remember saying that, by the way. He didn't remember saying that, but I do.
I wouldn't say anything that cliche.
No, it's not, because he's not a cliche type of guy normally. I mean, if you raise the term bonding with him, he'd grimace. He doesn't bond with people, kids, or anybody. But he did say that, and I remembered it, and it's something that's stuck with me all my life, and I've actually shared that with my son. no matter where you go, it's always there. It's never changed. Time, distance, doesn't matter. That same feeling is still there with you. Don't ever feel differently. That's the way it is. So of course, he forgot he said that, but I didn't have to remind him. He said it, you know.
Nice.
Can I say one thing?
Just
to circle back to, I don't know if this is a little bit shameless, I guess, Gil, but the working title for the novel I've been working on is called Alligators and Cream Cheese, which I thought was a kind of an appropriate, summary of this mishmash between Jews and good old boy rednecks in South Florida in the 1980s, and my character's role in that environment. And if it gets, if I ever get it printed, if I'm so lucky, I can envision the cover being a bagel with, an alligator popping out of the middle of the bagel menacingly. And that would be Alligators and Cream Cheese.
I look forward to it. I will help any way I can, of course. You know me, but
I appreciate that.
I'm very sad for you and the family, but I'm glad we got to talk. I'm, like I said at the top when you sprung the news on me, and I'm looking at the picture now from 2014 when I recorded with him. It really was one of the high points of my life, just getting to sit down with him, even though he didn't have his hearing aids, which he managed to lose right before I got there. I took it as an insult, but again, neurotic Jew that I am, that's fine.
Well, BJF wouldn't insult anybody unless they deserved it, and you did not, so you wouldn't have done that.
I feel like I'd have brought it on myself later. So, all right, we'll talk soon. And again, I know it'll take a while before there can be any sort of event, but keep me in the loop, and I'll
Absolutely
write to the brothers after this. So
sure.
I hope we get together soon, man.
Thank you for the opportunity to share and talk with you. It's fun. I wish I could hang out with you in a city sometime. We had talked about that. I think we talked about going to the Mission Chinese restaurant years ago. We never pulled that off.
That was Kipp Friedman. His bar mitzvah photography, bar and bat mitzvah photography business is Photos by Kipp, KIPP.com. But as we said, that's defunct in the era of social distancing. You should check out his memoir, Barracuda in the Attic, which was published by Fantagraphics in 2013. It's a really lovely piece of writing about growing up Friedman. And as I talked about in yesterday's repost of my 2014 conversation with their dad, go get Bruce J. Friedman's fiction. Go get the collected short fiction of Bruce J. Friedman. Go get Stern, A Mother's Kisses, the Harry Towns books. If you haven't read Bruce J's work before, you are in for a treat. Anyway, that was what I think is an interesting conversation. We'll be back Monday with another COVID check-in. It'll be with Liza Donnelly, the New Yorker cartoonist. In the meantime, visit vmspod.com and chimeraobscura.com/VM, where you can find a link to the COVID-19 sessions with all of these daily podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show via iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcatcher to make sure you get every episode, including the 370 or so in-person ones I recorded in the before time. Now, if you can spare anything, do not give me any money. I don't need the Patreon support. My expenses are way down for the podcast nowadays. My job is paying me just fine. What I think you should do is support the artists and writers and other people in need that you can. Go find their Patreons, GoFundMes, Kickstarters, Indiegogos, tip jars, whatever it is, and show them some support. If you're not comfortable giving to individuals, and that can be an issue because people, then go find some worthwhile charities like your local food bank and other places that'll help people in need. On top of that, there are a lot of bail funds, freedom funds, etc., because there are a ton of, we'll say, unfair arrests that are happening right now. There are also a lot of people who are going to be in medical need because of quote-unquote non-lethal police activity. Listen, times are tough. A lot of people and causes can use a hand right now. If you're in a position to help, then please help. I am Gil Roth. It is Friday, June 5th, 2020, and this was a bonus episode of my Virtual Memory Show podcast. Thank you for listening. Keep the conversation going. Stay safe. Wash your damn hands.